Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of The Haunted Walk, offering thematic walking tours in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director of the company, and thank you so much for spending a little of your day today with us and listening to the show. We have a fantastic interview lined up for you, as we had the amazing opportunity to speak with one of the leaders in the field of skepticism. We'll be speaking with Professor Christopher French. We'll be touching on a wide range of topics, including the paranormal, as well as UFOs, conspiracy theories, so some really interesting stuff. Before we get to that, if you've been listening to the show, you know that this summer we are offering special Haunted Walk experiences. One of those takes place at the Mackenzie King Estate in Gatineau Park. Well, at the end of August, we're doing a special event tied to his grandfather, who was William Lyon Mackenzie, the first mayor of Toronto, and a key figure in the Upper Canada Rebellion. On Friday, August 28th, our original Haunted Walk of Toronto will include a trip inside Mackenzie House, which was his residence. And it was in that residence, on August 28th, that he passed away. So being there on that anniversary, I think, is going to make for a very special and fascinating evening. And if you're interested in information about that special walk, which includes the Mackenzie House visit, please visit our website, which is hauntedwalk.com, and then just look up the information for the Toronto tours. And you should find everything there. A quick reminder, be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to keep up with the latest and greatest from the company. Now, on to today's show. Professor Chris French is the head of the Anomalistic Psychology Research Unit at Goldsmiths, University of London. He is a fellow of the British Psychological Society and a member of the Scientific and Professional Advisory Board of the British False Memory Society. He has published well over 120 articles and chapters covering a wide range of topics. He frequently appears on radio and television, casting a skeptical eye over paranormal claims, as well as writing for The Guardian and Skeptic magazine. His most recent book, co-authored with Anna Stone, is Anomalistic Psychology, Exploring Paranormal Belief and Experience. Thank you, Professor Chris French, for joining us today. Really looking forward to our conversation.
Likewise.
You have a very interesting title that I think many of us would be envious of, and that is you are the head and founder of the Anomalistic Psychology Research Unit at Goldsmiths College, University of London. Now, anomalistic psychology is a term that I wasn't overly familiar with before kind of reading about your background. Could you explain to our listeners a bit about what that term refers to? What is anomalistic psychology all about?
I will indeed. The reason that I kind of I didn't actually, the term is not mine. I did not invent the term anomalistic psychology, but I used to have a situation where I was frequently asked by people, what's your research interest? What's your main research area? And I would reply that it was the psychology of paranormal beliefs and ostensibly paranormal experiences, and that obviously was a bit of a mouthful. Mm-hmm. So I decided that the best thing to do would be to see if I could come up with something that was a little bit more concise than that. And looking around, it appeared that the best term was in fact anomalistic psychology. And what anomalistic psychology is, it's primarily focused upon trying to come up with non-paranormal explanations for ostensibly paranormal experiences. So trying to explain those experiences in conventional psychological terms, if you like. And so that meant that when people asked me what was my area of interest, I could say, it's anomalistic psychology. And then they would reply, what the hell is anomalistic psychology? And I had to say, it's the psychology of ostensibly paranormal experiences and paranormal. So I didn't really gain anything. But actually, what's happened over the years is that more and more people are becoming familiar with the term anomalistic psychology. As I say, I didn't invent it. It's been around for a few decades. And as I say, it's a particular approach to trying to explain the weird experiences that people definitely do have.
I'd be interested to hear what your colleagues thought, maybe when you first founded the unit. Was there any skepticism from colleagues in the academic world about what you were undertaking?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it was quite interesting that at the time, I mean, I was explicitly kind of told by my head of department that he'd kind of tolerate me messing around in this weird stuff, as long as I also kept up the proper research, the more respectable research, you know. And I mean, that was quite interesting because, I mean, I couldn't be much more kind of vocal about the fact that I'm a skeptic where the paranormal is concerned. And so it actually gave me an awful lot of respect for parapsychologists who are actually more sympathetic towards paranormal claims. Because, I mean, those guys must have to put up with a huge amount of prejudice. Mm-hmm. Now, as far as I'm concerned, it's a perfectly legitimate issue to be investigating from whatever perspective. But clearly, there's such a huge amount of skepticism on the part of the wider scientific community that even though, you know, it was obvious to everybody that I was skeptical about these claims, the general attitude was, well, why are you interested in this nonsense? You know, we all know that ghosts don't exist. We all know that telepathy isn't real. Well, actually, no, we don't know that. You know, if I had to bet, I would bet that is the case, but I could be wrong. And also, as a psychologist, I've got to be interested in the fact that the majority of people do believe in this stuff, and a sizable minority claim to have had direct personal experience of the paranormal. And therefore, if we ignore it, we're ignoring a huge part of what it means to be human. So I think that attitude has changed over the years, and now I kind of quite rarely come across it. But certainly, yep, in the early days. And you know, I'm used to people cracking jokes about my research. I think I've heard them all. And, you know, I enjoy them. I'm quite happy with that. But you know, you do want people to realise that underneath all that, there is some serious research, some serious questions to be asked.
I have to ask, when you were in school yourself, was this the line of psychology you thought you might end up in, or what kind of led you to this really unique and specialized field?
And when I was in school, I wasn't remotely interested in psychology at all. My passion as a kid was always astronomy, and that's really what I wanted to do until kind of people put me off a little bit by saying, you know, it's not all about looking through telescopes. You know, it's all very mathematical and technical, and that kind of put me off. And so the decision to pursue psychology was one of those kind of typical decisions that you make at the age of 18 when you know nothing, you know. Yep. I just kind of thought, well, outer space, inner space, yeah, they're both interesting. I'll do psychology. And ironically, I mean, for my PhD, which I ended up doing some years later, it was all on about analysing EEG signals, brain waves and so on. So it was all very complicated time signal analysis, exactly the same area of maths that you would have done if you'd been analysing signals from radio telescopes. So, you know, maybe I should have gone in for astronomy after all. But no, I'm quite happy now. I'm fascinated by the area I've ended up working in. But no, I didn't actually start off. I mean, in fact, I used to be a believer. I mean, I know I've said this many times. I used to believe in all this stuff. And I can specifically remember that when I was in my final years at school before I went to university, Uri Geller appeared on the scene. Okay. And I was completely taken in by Geller. I was convinced he was the real deal, and I was absolutely delighted about it. There seemed to be scientists saying, yep, this guy really can do it. And I was so excited by that. I so wanted it to be true. And it really wasn't until many years later that I became a skeptic. And that, in fact, was due to one of your fellow Canadians. That was reading one particular book by a social psychologist called James Alcock. Okay. And the book was called Parapsychology, Science or Magic. And it was a very skeptical appraisal of paranormal claims, putting forward lots of alternative explanations in terms of conventional psychology, which sounded very, very plausible to me and seemed to be supported by good empirical evidence. So I went from being a believer to being, at the time, probably fairly extreme skeptic. I think I've kind of come back towards the middle ground a little bit. I'm still a skeptic, but I no longer hold various views which, when I first became a skeptic, I held. Things like all parapsychologists are idiots and don't know how to design an experiment. That's just not true. All people who claim to have psychic powers are deliberate fraudsters. Again, just not true. People who believe in the paranormal are just either stupid, mad, or lying. Again, none of those things are true. And I think an important part of skepticism is being open to the possibility that you might be wrong. You might have to change your ideas if new evidence comes along. But for the time being, on the basis of the evidence as I see it, I'm not convinced that any genuine paranormal phenomena exist. But as I say, I'm always open to the possibility I might be wrong.
And I'm sure many of our listeners may be aware you are the former editor-in-chief of the Skeptic magazine, which the UK version, which I've had the opportunity to read a few times and have absolutely enjoyed it. So if you have any interest in this area at all, definitely check out the magazine if you ever get a chance. But is that how you would define your skepticism? Are you disinclined to believe until there's proof? And how does I imagine the believers, who maybe we'll talk about in a moment, I imagine their retort to you has to do with bias. That it's kind of the opposite. Instead of trying to prove the phenomenon is real, they probably consider you're trying to prove the phenomenon does not exist. How do you strike that balance from that open perspective you're talking about?
Well, I think you're quite right. I mean, what skepticism, for me, proper skepticism, is all about is not dismissing ideas without considering the evidence. It's about looking at the evidence and coming to an informed conclusion on the basis of that evidence and sound reasoning wherever possible. Having said that, yep, we're all biased. To people who kind of say, I'm completely neutral. I just assess the evidence. Nonsense. It's a very naive thing to say. None of us are like that. Our views might change, our beliefs might change, but at any particular moment in time, we've got particular beliefs, we've got particular views on things, and they will colour the way that we assess the evidence. There's no doubt at all about that. I mean, I'm often kind of quoted out of context on that. People who on the other side of the debate want to say Chris French even admits that he's biased. Yeah, but I mean, putting that in context, I'm saying that everybody is.
Yeah,
just me. From my point of view, the best way to try to get to the truth of a claim is through well-controlled studies that rule out any possibility, or at least minimise any possibility of your own biases affecting the outcome. So, for example, we very often test psychics who are making specific claims. And so what we will do is we will design a test in conjunction with the psychic. There's no point in carrying out a test that the psychic is saying from the word go, I can't do it under these conditions. As long as we can maintain experimental control, we'll bend over backwards to make the conditions optimal for the psychic. We get them to sign something in advance to say this is a fair test of whatever claim they're making, and then we go ahead and run the test. And then afterwards, and so far it's always been the case that they have failed the tests, they then make up excuses as to why it actually wasn't a fair test after all.
Sure.
And all we can say is, well, we can't say that proves you don't have psychic powers. We can say, well, you were unable to demonstrate any psychic powers in the particular test that we carried out. People can draw their own conclusions from that. But that's what we do, basically. We try to make sure that we test the claims as fairly as we possibly can. We're open to the possibility that maybe at some point in the future, somebody will come up with some reliable, robust, and replicable demonstration of some kind of paranormal effect. But I don't think we're there yet.
Interesting. And if we flip the coin for a moment, I imagine you've had plenty of opportunity to interact with believers, I guess we would call the opposite perspective. In your research and discussions with these folks, two questions pop to mind. Is there any pattern in those individuals who are more likely to believe things without evidence or proof? And then is there any why do we want to believe? Why do we want to believe some of these things that are so difficult or unimaginable?
Well, I think, with respect to the question of whether there's any particular kind of pattern or psychological profile to people who want to believe in the paranormal, or people who do believe in the paranormal, again, I'd probably kind of disentangle a few aspects of that question. I think if you were to ask me the question, is there a particular kind of psychological profile for people who claim to have had direct personal experience of the paranormal, then I think the answer to that is yes. We're only talking about group trends, and there'll be lots of exceptions to the picture I'm about to paint. But in terms of comparing people who claim they have directly personal experience of the paranormal to those who don't make such claims, you will, at the group level, find that people who claim to have experienced the paranormal tend to score higher on various measures, such as fantasy proneness. They tend to be very, very imaginative, very creative individuals on the positive side. They're people who've got very, very good imaginations. They're probably more susceptible to false memories than others, and so on and so forth. When it comes to the question of belief, then that's kind of a little bit more complicated, because obviously, if you believe you've directly experienced the paranormal, you are going to believe in the paranormal. But a lot of people who believe in the paranormal don't claim that they have directly, personally experienced it. They believe it for other reasons. They might believe it because somebody in their family or their friends have said they've had various experiences, and they know those people wouldn't lie to them. They might believe it because of stuff they've read in the media, documentaries they've seen on TV. They might believe it because of their assessment of the current state of the scientific evidence. There's all sorts of very reasonable reasons why people might say, well, actually, I do believe that there is something in these paranormal claims. So there's a whole spectrum there, and it ranges from people who are, if you like, very, very, very deficient when it comes to assessing evidence, and critical thinking skills are just non-existent in those people. So they may well believe absolutely every single ridiculous paranormal claim that they ever come across, to other people who actually think very logically, very intelligent people, who on balance think that the evidence does probably favour the paranormal being real. I'm not one of those skeptics. As I say, I went through a phase of this, but I'm no longer one of those skeptics who sees all believers as being kind of stupid. I think that, that's a kind of very, very simplistic, naive approach for a skeptic to take. There's a huge amount of variation. Obviously, you do get cases of people who are deliberate liars, people who are suffering from mental illness, people who are maybe not that bright, but you get that on both sides of the debate, not just on the believers' side. So, yeah, I suppose that's how I'd answer that question.
Yeah.
The question was why people wanted to believe, and I think that's a really interesting question. Again, trying to put myself in the mindset of somebody who once did believe in all this stuff. For one thing, it was just incredibly exciting to my eyes.
True.
It made the world a more interesting place. I now kind of think, well, actually, real science is just as exciting. But without wishing to sound elitist, it's all right for Richard Dawkins to kind of wax lyrical, and for Brian Cox and all these other people to go on about the amazing universe around us, from galaxies down to subatomic level and so on and so forth. But you do have to have a certain degree of intelligence to appreciate the picture that science paints, whereas the paranormal worldview is a little bit more simple, and still very exciting for some people. And of course, another big factor is we're all afraid of death. None of us like the idea that we ain't going to be around at some point, and we don't like the idea that when our loved ones pass away, we're never going to hear from them again. That's it. End of story. So the biggest cognitive bias that pervades human consciousness is confirmation bias. We find it much easier to believe things that we want to be true anyway. So wanting to believe in life after death, wanting to see evidence around us that the death of the body isn't the end of consciousness, the evidence itself doesn't have to be that good to convince us.
It's very interesting. I find parallels with my own life. I remember in grade school, just devouring the books on things like Bigfoot, the UFOs, and now at this point in my life, I think I've watched Cosmos with Neil deGrasse Tyson, several times because the science is it's almost more unbelievable than the stories of hairy creatures walking around, in the woods. Is there any, speaking of the believers, is it generally dispersed among the population, or is it? Are there higher rates of it in certain cultures, nationalities, geographic regions? Does that play any role in the skepticism believer position?
There are variations between countries, but I think that the bottom line is that within all societies that we're aware of, there is at least a sizable minority, sometimes a majority of the population, who will endorse at least one paranormal claim. Now, the actual details of the claims that are big in particular cultures might vary. And that, again, itself is fascinating. I mean, we can look from our modern Western perspective at ideas that are kind of taken very seriously by a lot of our own populations, and yet would be kind of seen as being ridiculous in other cultures, and vice versa. So if we look at documentaries where someone's gone into some kind of pre-industrial tribe and they've got various beliefs about being possessed by animal spirits or dragons or whatever, we think how quaint, and yet, what's so different about the beliefs that are taken seriously in our own culture? And you look back historically, one of the questions I will always ask, in fact, in my anomalistic psychology course, I ask how many of the students believe in fairies. And of course, you typically get one or two jokers putting their hands up, but I don't think they're serious. I mean, basically, in our cultures, adults do not believe in fairies. But you go back 100 years, and the situation was very different. There was a very large percentage of people, educated, totally sane people, who did believe in fairies, because at that point it was a more accepted part of the culture. I mean, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote a book declaring that fairies were real. They were even photographed, in the famous Potting Fairies case, and those photos were declared to be not fakes by photographic experts. It all sounds very reminiscent of the modern UFO craze.
It does indeed, yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I'd be curious if our listeners and I, we magically were transported and we got to become honorary members of the APRU, the Anomalistic Psychology Research Unit.
Of course, you're all very welcome to come to our talk series should you ever find yourself in the UK.
Absolutely. I think those would be fascinating to come to. What would we expect if we were to be a member of the team for, say, a few months? What type of work would we be doing? Would we be doing kind of research with, online or books, things like that? Or are we out in the field conducting these experiments? What's kind of the balance of the of what the unit does?
It's actually very, very varied is the short answer. So, in very general terms, there are two strands to the research. On the one hand, we have the main focus of what we do, which is what I said before. We try to come up with non-paranormal explanations for ostensibly paranormal experiences and paranormal beliefs. I'll give you a couple of examples of that in a second. And we try then to put those explanations to the test. And typically what we're doing there would be very similar to any other branch of experimental psychology, except, of course, the questions that we're asking might be a little bit different. We also do test actual psychic claims, paranormal claims directly, and I suppose, but the other main strand, that is the other main strand, that although we have a generally skeptical approach to the paranormal, I kind of mean it when I say that I recognise that we might be wrong. So we will put considerable effort into actually directly testing paranormal claims. That side of our work often comes up if we're approached by, say, a TV company who are doing a documentary on a particular psychic, and they say, could you test this guy's claims or this woman's claims? And we'll say, yeah, we'll have a go. We'll do it. And so, it is incredibly varied what we end up doing. And so there's the research side, and then some of those things that we do will end up being written up and submitted for publication to standard scientific journals. We also do a lot of public engagement. We organise events, activities, talks. And unfortunately, from my point of view, as with any other university post, there's always the kind of boring side of things.
Yes.
Such as admin and writing student references and all that kind of very essential stuff, but not particularly exciting, which takes up far too much of your time. In terms of the exciting stuff we do, I mean, it's very much the kind of the public engagement stuff. We're big on that because obviously this is the public are very interested in these issues. And also, it's very media friendly. We do lots of TV and radio and so on. And I mean, as I say, it can vary from kind of spending time replying to emails from people who want to tell you about their own experiences. Each day is very varied, which is great. You don't ever have two similar weeks, one after the other.
I bet it sounds like an absolutely fascinating job. I am quite envious. As we are the Haunted Walk, I think where we need to spend some time is hearing a little bit about your research into paranormal activity. Just to fill you in, as far as our perspective is, I think we tend to be a little bit skeptical as well, trying to eliminate, the most obvious reasons for things happening. But I'd be curious maybe if you could share with us a couple cases. One where maybe there seemed like a very grand, exceptional case, which turned out to be quite easy to explain, or you feel quite confident in your explanation. And maybe another case where you haven't really reached a conclusion that you found as satisfactory as you would like.
Okay. Well, I mean, again, a lot of that side of what I get involved in, it's often due to kind of taking part in TV programs. So, I mean, typically we don't actually do that much work where somebody will give us a call and say, "I think my house is haunted," and we'll go out like Ghostbusters and investigate. We don't do that. But I have taken part in a number of TV series and one-off TV programs over the years, and that's been really interesting as well, even though I've not necessarily wrote that stuff up for publication in a formal journal. So in terms of something which, I'll tell you this story anyway because it's a good story. I took part in a TV series in the UK called Haunted Homes. And I have to say, it was typical of the genre. It would involve a team of us going in to investigate, typically in ordinary houses where people genuinely believed that their houses were haunted. And the team consisted of the star of the show, who was our psychic. We had a paranormal investigator who would go in with lots and lots of electronic kit. Mm-hmm. And then there was the professional wet blanket, i.e. me, who would go in and pour cold water on everybody's claims. And the one example that I have in mind of something which, certainly the way it was presented in the TV program, should you ever have the misfortune to see it, was that this was kind of something really, really spooky and hard to explain. This was not in a house. This was in a radio station in the Midlands in the UK called Radio Beacon. Various things had been reported at this radio station over the years, and in particular recurring themes were that sometimes people thought they could hear children singing Ring a Ring a Roses, the children's nursery rhyme.
That's creepy. Yeah.
And also occasionally they'd hear this sneeze. And there were various other things as well, but they were the two that I'll kind of focus on. The format for the program was always the same. They would get the people who lived there, or in this case worked there, to keep a video diary for a couple of weeks themselves. And so the program featured a couple of the guys who worked at the radio station sitting on this landing in the dark, all being filmed with a night camera. And suddenly they came and say, "God, what was that?" And they'd obviously heard this strange sneezing sound. Now, at the time, one of them suddenly makes the connection between that and Ring a Ring a Roses, because lots of people believe that Ring a Ring a Roses is a nursery rhyme that arose during the time of the Black Death, and it's somehow related. In fact, it's not. That's a myth. That's what we skeptics are here to do. Just dismiss everything. But it turns out that's not actually true. But a lot of people believe that, and he suddenly thought that was the link. The kids were singing about the Black Death, something from the Black Death, and sneezing was one of the symptoms, and boom, there's the connection. So he was quite freaked out by it. Anyway, when we actually went along to do our investigation, when we turned up, one of the things that was a standard part of the format was that there would be a vigil where many members of the team would sit there in the dark throughout the night, again, all being filmed with night cameras, and just see what happened. And they realized very early on, when we started making the programs, that if you had the skeptic around, it didn't really seem to work too well, because people didn't get psyched up. You'd be sitting there in the dark, and there'd be some noise, and someone would go, "Oh, what was that?" Yeah. And the boring old skeptic here would say, "I think it's just your central heating cooling down," and that kind of really dampens the atmosphere.
The wet blanket effect.
Exactly. So they used to lock me outside.
Oh, no.
I was outside in a Winnebago watching everything through remote cameras. And then at the end of the night, I would be allowed to go in and have a walk around and so on. But that meant that our psychic was in there with them, and she was very good at getting people psyched up, So, what was that? I don't know. Oh, can you see something over there? Oh, God, and then psychologically they'd just all get themselves freaked out and start seeing and hearing things that just were never recorded on the cameras or on the any other devices, with this one exception, where while they were doing the vigil, they actually recorded the ghostly sneeze. And so the next morning they were able to play this back to me, and sure enough, there was definitely a sound on the tape. And I kind of did an interview to camera saying, well, yeah, it could be a sneeze, but it could be 1,001 other things. You just can't tell. Anyway, the next night, because again, the standard part of the format, we not only investigated your ghost for you, we got rid of it. We performed a public service. So the next night, we were going to go in to do the cleansing ritual. And just before this started, I popped into the toilet on the landing where the noise had been recorded. And as I came out of the cubicle, our paranormal investigator was there with a very disgruntled look on his face, pointing to the wall. And I looked at where he was pointing, not knowing what I was going to see. Was this going to be ectoplasmic snot, or what was it going to be? No, it was an automatic air freshener.
Oh.
So we hung around for a minute or two, and sure enough, that was the noise. We absolutely nailed it. We knew that was what the noise was. So we did an interview to camera the next day to explain that, we know it wasn't a ghost. It was this automatic air freshener. Strangely enough, though, when the program went out, they had time to cover the recording of the ghostly sneeze, but they didn't have enough time to include our explanation.
Oh,
so
are you kidding? That's awful.
So I suppose that's one where we definitely nailed it in terms of what the explanation was. And
I would say so, yeah.
it was to our paranormal investigator's credit that, once he'd figured out it was definitely not paranormal, he was quite happy to say that. He was the one who discovered this, not me, But anyway, they didn't want to cover that. In terms of other kind of programs that I've taken part in where there has been stuff,
or we could even branch it out to be, I'd like to touch on a few different areas as well. But is there one particular area of all the different fields you look at that you feel you still don't have a good grasp on, or still have a lot of questions?
Oh no, I think that is definitely the case. I mean, I think there are some branches, some areas within parapsychology where the skeptics could not, in my opinion, in all honesty, claim, oh no, we've explained all that away, we can account for all that. There are kind of interesting ideas. I mean, again, it annoys me when you get skeptics who say there is no evidence for paranormal claims. There is evidence. It's the quality of the evidence that we're talking about, and what's the most plausible explanation for that evidence. So I can remember reading Carl Sagan's book, Demon Haunted World, and he mentioned 3 areas at that time that he felt, although they were not, he like me, he didn't actually believe they proved the paranormal, but he thought that they were kind of real serious challenges to a skeptical perspective. One related to the area of what's called micro-PK, micro-psychokinesis, the idea that just by kind of intention or willpower, you can influence the output from a random event generator in very, very tiny but statistically significant ways. A second area was related to Ganzfeld research, which, if any of your listeners are not familiar with it, is a particular way of investigating telepathy, where you have one person who is the sender, who basically you put them into a state of sensory, of perceptual deprivation. So you put ping pong balls over their eyes so that they could, and a red light bulb on, so that if they open their eyes, all they'll see is red. You put earphones on with white noise coming over them. You have them lying on a comfortable couch in a room that's at body temperature. It's extremely relaxing, and your head starts to fill with imagery. That's the receiver. I said it was the sender, didn't I? That's the receiver in that state. Okay. The sender is in a distant location, and they are either asked to look at pictures or video clips that are randomly selected and try to transmit that information to the receiver. And on each trial, the set of possible targets is usually 4. One is randomly selected. That's the one that the person concentrates on. And then you can judge the degree of match. Either the receiver themselves can do it, or independent judges can do it. And you would expect to get a hit rate of 1 in 4 just by chance, if it was just guesswork. And it's often claimed you get a hit rate of 1 in 3. Now, if that's the case, then it's very hard to think of any other explanation other than telepathy for what's going on there. And, you know, I mean, I'm not convinced, for various reasons that maybe we don't have time to go into, that telepathy is the best explanation for those reports in the literature. But certainly it's an interesting challenge. I mean, they're not, the experiments themselves, no experiment is perfect, but they're not that bad. They seem pretty good. So you have to try and then kind of decide what you think might be going on here. So that's the second area, the Ganzfeld studies. The third related to children who seem to spontaneously remember having lived past lives.
Oh, yes.
And it's in that area, in fact, that one of the TV programs that I took part in left me wondering what was going on, and maybe, just maybe, there really was something in that.
And this is where children remember details they couldn't possibly have known. Is that the key
that's
proof?
That's the kind of thing. At least again, that's the way it's presented.
Yes, okay.
It's always important to make a distinction between the way these things might be presented, either in books or TV programs, and the way they actually were. And the reason I say that is, again, because of another TV program which I took part in, which was was, I think, still to this day, the most interesting and exciting TV program I've ever taken part in. We went to Lebanon to look at reincarnation claims amongst the Druze. The Druze are a particular religious sect, and reincarnation is central to their belief system. And a lot of the kids seem to spontaneously remember these past lives, and so it's kind of quite a fascinating topic. I went out there not knowing what to expect, because I hadn't done any work in that kind of an area. I'd read about it a little bit, but I didn't know what to expect. And I came back from that trip pretty convinced that we were dealing with false memories. And there are various reasons for that, which we can chat about if you want to. But that was one where I came away thinking, I think I do know what's going on there. This other program I did some years later, which was also on the idea of past life memories, was kind of more of a challenge to my skepticism. This was a little boy called Cameron who lived in Glasgow, very ordinary little kid. His mum was very down-to-earth woman, but he had, from the moment he could talk, always referred to this other life that he used to live. And his mother was just trying to find an explanation. She wasn't somebody who had always herself believed in reincarnation and was desperate to find evidence. She was willing to listen to all kinds of possible explanations. And my role in the program was to offer some skeptical explanations, which is what I did. I never actually, unfortunately, met Cameron directly. I just spoke to his mother, but they did take him back to. He claimed he had his past life had been on a Scottish island, the Isle of Barra, and they took him back to this place. And initially, they couldn't find anywhere that seemed to correspond to his description of his past life home, and they were about to give up. But then they found somewhere that did seem to fit rather well. However, even then, there were some aspects of his story that seemed to fit, and some that didn't. And the program was very fair in the way it presented it, But at the end of the day, you did wonder, well, was there maybe something in that one? It wasn't enough to kind of convert me from being a skeptic back to being a believer again. But as I say, I think you can kind of grade these things from the claims that I think the skeptics have pretty damn watertight, proven explanations for, to those that actually, no, we couldn't really claim that. There might be something in them. There might be.
Or we just don't have the explanation yet.
Yet, exactly, yeah. And that's something I think people find very difficult to do, just to say, we just don't know. I mean, it happens let's take UFOs, for example. I know that's not particularly your area.
Oh, definitely. I was going to ask you about UFOs, so I'd love to hear your thoughts, yeah.
Well, the same arguments apply, that even the people who believe in the extraterrestrial hypothesis, they quite readily accept that 95% plus of all reported sightings have mundane explanations. It's things like aeroplanes seen from unusual angles, celestial objects, laser shows. These days, Chinese lanterns cause a huge number of UFO sightings in the UK. It can be various things, and they'll quite have to accept that, yet 95% plus can be explained. It's the ones that can't be, that for them prove that ET is out there. Whereas from my point of view, I just think, well, no, it's just that we don't know what the explanation is. Could be anything. We don't expect the police to be able to solve every single crime they investigate. So why would we expect there to be a definitive, provable explanation for every single reported sighting?
That's a great point. Yeah.
There's going to be a percentage that we're just going to have to say, we don't know. Whatever it was, the evidence has gone away now. We can't tell.
Speaking of things that are explainable or unexplainable, I have to ask you about conspiracy theories, as I love reading conspiracy theories for entertainment value. Nothing else. My partner and I still have an ongoing debate if it would be even possible to fake the moon landing the way it did. And I know you've done some work in this area. Is there a certain conspiracy theory that a lot of people hold dear, but is just clearly such a stretch, or the evidence just really speaks against it?
I think the example you've just given there is a very good one. The number of people who believe that the moon landings never happened. And it's an interesting one as well, because you can watch some TV documentaries that would present the evidence in such a way that somebody who really hadn't looked at this very closely and thought about it may well find it very convincing. But again, the moment that you do actually start looking at each of the arguments that's put forward, the evidence just begins to crumble. One example would be the flag that's there waving in the wind on the moon. Yes. And of course, there's no atmosphere on the moon. Duh! Fancy NASA forgetting that. Of course they didn't forget that. What's caused that effect is that because they knew there was no atmosphere on the moon, there was a metal rod that goes out at a right angle from the shaft of the flagpole, and they just put it in the ground, and it was still vibrating from having done that. Mm-hmm. And again, it's one of those instances where once you actually start to dig in and look at the evidence, each bit falls apart. And that, of course, is a real problem in trying to argue with conspiracy theorists, because they'll say, okay, then yes, but what about, and then they'll point to something else. And you'll say, yeah, well, that can be explained because that was blah, 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 blah. And they say, okay, then yeah, but what about this? And it's like trying to nail jelly to the wall. They'll never actually kind of admit, yeah, you know what? You're probably right. And some of the conspiracies are just, for me, just completely exceed my boggle factor before we even begin. David Icke's claim that the world is being ruled by shape-shifting lizards. yeah, no, kind of, maybe George Bush. But, no, I mean, that's just going too far for me. I don't really. I mean, you might say, okay, well, this must be just prejudice on your part. You won't even look at his evidence. But I'm sorry, no, that just exceeds my boggle factor, and life's too short. You haven't got time to debunk in detail every single conspiracy. Some conspiracies will turn out to be true, no question about it. But a lot of the most widely held ones, can pretty readily be shown not to be true. And again, I think what we're interested in from a psychological point of view is that people differ so much in how ready they are to accept conspiracy explanations, to the extent that you can actually just make up. I mean, this has been done. Psychologists have done this. You make up a conspiracy just over a cup of coffee. You and I could do it now. Mm-hmm. We could just make something up. We could stick it on a questionnaire along with another range of more or less accepted conspiracies. And a sizable minority of the population would say, yep, I think that's true. Obviously, there couldn't be any evidence for it because we just made it up. But, there's a nice study by a friend of mine here in London where they made up a conspiracy for some research they were doing around the energy drink Red Bull.
Okay.
And in this country, probably the same, I don't know, maybe the same in your country, the advertising campaign for Red Bull is Red Bull gives you wings.
Yes, absolutely.
And one of the items on the questionnaire was that this line had come about because in experimental studies where they'd fed Red Bull to rats, they began to grow vestigial wings. Like, yep, believe that. Yep. I mean, you can almost, it beggars belief how ridiculous you can get and still find people who will quite readily say on the basis of no evidence whatsoever, yep, believe that,
Sure. As we're starting to run short on time, a couple other quick areas maybe you could hit on for us in kind of the ghostly paranormal area, and that would be demonic possession and sleep paralysis. Any interesting insights you've had into those fields or ideas as to what may be happening?
Well, I think, let's take sleep paralysis first there. I mean, I think in broad terms, we know what's going on with sleep paralysis. And again, for any of your listeners that don't know what sleep paralysis is, in its most basic form, it's very common. We typically find about 30 to 40% of our first-year students say, yes, they've had it at least once in their lives. So when you're half awake, half asleep, and you realize you can't move. And it typically lasts for a few seconds, and then you snap out of it. It's a little bit disconcerting, but it's no big deal. In a few people, much smaller percentage, few unfortunate individuals, it is much scarier than that. You may well get a very strong sense of presence. You feel as if there's someone or something in the room with you. You may also hallucinate. You may get visual hallucinations. You might see lights or dark shadows or monstrous figures. You might hear footsteps, mechanical sounds, voices. You might feel as if you're being dragged out of the bed, or as if
extremely unsettling stuff.
It can be terrifying, and I mean, I get sent lots and lots of first-hand reports of this, and some of them send a chill down my spine. They are really creepy. Now, obviously, if you've had an experience like that, it's not too surprising that you might think it was a ghost or it was a demon or that it was a precursor to being abducted by aliens. In fact, we do have there is a scientific and a medical literature on this. It's in itself, it can be terrifying, but actually it's nothing to get too worried about. And I'd like to get the message out there to people. If you've had this, it's neither that something paranormal has happened to you or that you're going crazy. It's this thing called sleep paralysis. And basically, when you go through the normal sleep cycle, you go through different stages and different psychophysiological measures change. Your heart rate changes, your breathing changes, your EEG changes. You go through stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4. You come back up through those, then you go into what's called REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. And it's during REM sleep that you have vivid dreams. And normally when you're in REM sleep, the muscles of your body are actually paralyzed, presumably to stop you acting out the actions of the dream. But in sleep paralysis, something goes a little bit haywire, and putting it very simply, it's as if your brain wakes up but your body doesn't. So You can see that you're in your bedroom, you can't move, and you've got all this weird dream imagery coming through into normal waking consciousness. And the result is one of these very scary episodes of sleep paralysis. So we know what causes it. It's been studied in the sleep laboratory. Is that we need more research into it, and in particular, we need research into how to try and help people who are experiencing it, how to reduce the frequency of attacks, and how to help people cope if they do have an attack. But in the full light of day, when you've woken up and it's all in the past, it really isn't anything to be too concerned about. Or you can get this horrible cycle where people are anything that disturbs the sleep cycle will make it more likely to happen if you are susceptible to it. So you can get to a situation where people become so frightened of going to sleep that by staying awake so long, they're making it more likely it will happen when they fall asleep. Which is a bit sad. So that's sleep paralysis. I mean, in other cultures, it's interpreted as attacks by ghosts, attacks by demons. Back in the Middle Ages, it was attacks by sex-crazed demons. Just to add a bit of spice to it,
just to make it colorful. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, in these days, it's often at the root of alien abduction claims. But essentially, as I say, we know what it is. There's a fantastic website called the Sleep Paralysis Project. Go there. I worked with Carla McKinnon, who put that website together, and she's a filmmaker. She made a short film. It's about 9 minutes long, an animation based on her own sleep paralysis experiences, and it's a fantastic bit of work. It's incredibly creepy, and it really captures what sleep paralysis is all about. So go there, the Sleep Paralysis Project. And what was the question you asked? Sorry,
it was possession.
Possession, yeah. Again, it's difficult to summarize this one in kind of 12 words or less, but I'll give it my best shot. Certainly, historically, before we know what we know now about the brain and about neurological type disorders, it's not too difficult to understand why people suffering from certain kinds of problems, neuropsychiatric problems, may have been labeled as being possessed. So, for example, Tourette's, certain forms of epilepsy, certain forms of schizophrenia, and so on. We should know better now, and so unfortunately, some people still don't. But those kinds of things were labeled as being, possession by some kind of outside entity that had taken over the person, and in some cases, it would even feel like that to the person. So it's not surprising that those labels were attached. I don't think you can explain all cases of ostensible possession as being down to those kind of conditions. There is also a kind of a separate category, if you like, that can be better explained in socio-cognitive terms. It may sound surprising, but there are certain advantages to be gained from taking on the role of being the possessed person. So, for example, if you live in a very religious community where people believe in demons and Satan and so on and so forth, then if you have in the past maybe engaged in behavior that was very antisocial, maybe you drank too much, got into fights, you were a womanizer, or if you were a woman, you slept around, you did all kinds of things that the community didn't approve of, to have this excuse that, no, actually, that wasn't me. It was the demon. It was the demon that made me do it. It's kind of quite a tempting proposition. So you take on the role. I'm not even saying that people are consciously doing this as a kind of. It's more subtle than that. But you can imagine, for example, if you're an alcoholic, there must be times when you are so craving a drink that it really does feel as if there's something there in your head that doesn't belong there. Mm-hmm. So you can convince yourself that this is some kind of possession, some kind of demon. You then go through an exorcism ritual and you're welcomed back into the loving arms of your community. And it serves everybody. Everyone's a winner. You've won because you've been welcomed back. The exorcist has won because they've taken on this heroic role and defeated the most powerful evil forces in the universe thanks to their faith in Christ. And the religious community have had their beliefs reinforced. What's
interesting.
Not to like?
That's extremely fascinating.
The tragedy is, of course, that if that label of possession is applied by, say, to kids who are just being naughty, as has happened in several cases in the UK recently, and then some kind of possession, some kind of exorcism exorcism takes place that involves basically child abuse, and there have been kids killed as a result of this. So I'm not saying it's all fantastic by any means. It can be absolutely horrendous, but you can see why in some communities it might actually work for those communities.
Yeah, that's interesting. I had never considered the kind of the secondary effects of possession like that, almost the power relations involved with it. Very interesting. A couple questions before we let you go, as I think it's very rare that any of us will have an opportunity to speak to really a professional skeptic. When in day-to-day life we encounter a claim or we see something, we believe we witness something that we, seems difficult to believe, are there any questions or tools in our toolkit we should immediately kind of be asking ourselves anytime we face these claims or situations or experiences?
I think there's a lot to be. One of the reasons that I kind of like anomalistic psychology is because it's a fantastic tool for teaching critical thinking skills that apply much more widely, exactly to the kind of thing you're talking about now, but even to things like how you kind of assess evidence of quality of something you want to buy or you're thinking about buying, or
political claims I assume would fall
exactly,
as well.
Absolutely. Recognizing that we're kind of all biased, asking kind of who benefits from me believing this, and what might be their motivations. Not to kind of encourage out and out paranoia. I think generally most people are pretty decent. That's my very naive view of the world. But just to kind of have a bit more critical thinking. And one very, very important thing is to remember that personal experience is not the best guide. That sounds to most people like complete nonsense. What better guide could you have? I saw it with my own eyes. Well, no, you can see stuff with your own eyes that just ain't so. It just isn't true. So both memory and perception are very, very susceptible to biases, to distortion. And one of the nice things about teaching anomalistic psychology is you can actually demonstrate this to people. You can make them experience it directly, and it should make us all, I think, just a little bit more, a little bit less confident about our assertions. At the end of the day, though, of course, I'm just as human as everybody else. So if I think that I've just seen something and somebody else disagrees with what I've seen, I'll end up arguing with them. I'll still be as convinced as anyone else. But when I step back and think about it in a more cool, rational manner, realize that you could be wrong. This is, again, there's a lot of the work in this area has got huge implications for the legal system. Our reliance on eyewitness testimony is so misplaced. Mm-hmm. We know that people simply misremember, misrecall. They're being 100% sincere and honest doesn't mean they're right.
Interesting. That's a great note to leave our main interview with. I just wanted to quickly ask you about the 16th European Skeptics Conference taking place in London, September to 11th and 13th. I understand the AAPRU helps organize that. I had a look at the program. It looks absolutely incredible. Could you tell us a few of the highlights or a few of the activities that will be going on around the conference?
I will indeed. We've got a very full conference program. All kinds of really interesting speakers. We've got lots of the sessions will be on the paranormal, but by no means all of them. We've got a whole morning on APRU research, which is what we've been talking about just. We've got Professor Jim Al-Khalili, who is a big name over here he's a physicist and he's a very, very influential speaker. He has TV series, etc. We've got Professor Edzard Ernst, who is a professor of complementary medicine, but also a brilliant scientist, and therefore has looked at the empirical evidence and become pretty much a skeptic. We've also got a couple of pre-Congress special events that we're just finalising now, where we'll have people like Simon Singh. We've got Richard Wiseman. He's going to be doing some of these sessions as well as being in the conference proper. just generally a pretty damn fabulous lineup and a great way to spend a few days in September.
I think I might have to talk to the boss and try to convince him to front my plane fare for a trip over, because it does sound like it would be an excellent time. We will put the link up to the conference in the show notes. So if anybody wants to check that out, just go to the website, which is hauntedwalk.com/podcasts. And Professor Chris French, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been an extremely interesting conversation, and we will definitely be following your work with great interest.
My pleasure. Great talking to you, Jim.
Felt very fortunate to be able to speak with Professor French. The work he's doing is so interesting, mind-boggling almost in some ways, and really glad he's out there doing that. If you are enjoying listening to the show, definitely urge you to subscribe on iTunes to the podcast. You can also leave ratings and reviews there, which we love to get, so please do that if you're enjoying it on an Apple product. If you're a non-Apple user, the show is also available on Stitcher, so you can listen to the show and also rate the show on there as well. We'd be grateful for any support you could offer. Just a quick reminder, our website is hauntedwalk.com. You can find all the information there about our regular tours taking place in Kingston, Ottawa, Toronto, as well as the special events we're doing this summer, including the one on Friday, August 28th in Toronto that I mentioned off the top. Thanks for listening to the show, and until we meet again, sweet dreams.